So we are now recording. So I'd like to welcome everyone to this workshop. This workshop is say sponsored by our Tripods effort here at Rutgers, which is dealing with the interface of automation and humans. And in particular, this part of the workshop is part of our group that's trying to think about robotic control. And so we're very happy that Dan and his group have agreed to have discussions with us. And so this is part of the beginning of these discussions. You will try to keep track of everybody who has signed in here so that if people are interested, and people should be using the chat to set up connections and talk to one another about what's going on if you find this interesting. So again, with that having been said, I'm going to turn it over to Dan. Dan, can you share your screen?
Here's the moment of truth. Let's see if I can. Always the scary moment, right?
So it looks good.
Does that look good now? Let's see.
That looks great.
PowerPoint, will PowerPoint cooperate?
Yes.
Let's just see. What do you think? Is PowerPoint?
It's working. It's working. That's awesome.
Is it projecting my secret notes with all my insults to Yuli, or is it?
No, just. I think we're only seeing what you want us to see. So.
Okay. Oh, so Konstantin, thank you so much for organizing and hosting the meeting. I'm very excited that we would have the intersection of the group. So, what I'm going to do. Oops. Let me. It would help if I start at the beginning, right, rather than at the end. Yeah. So what I want to do today is, you know, I'm on a grand soapbox these days. I wrote a diatribe, a manifesto that you can read. If you want to know where I'm coming from, read my review that's just come out in the annual reviews of Control Robotics Autonomous Systems. But roughly speaking, it's been a lifelong dream to try to develop formal primitives, robot behavioral primitives, using the language of dynamical systems theory that are endowed with compositional operators. And those operators have prescribed properties so that, you know, the composition of the limit is the limit of the compositions, and so on and so forth. And Matt's talk tomorrow is going to be focused much more on how do you get something like a dynamical systems theory to work in the funny world of robotics with all its hybrid things and discontinuities and making and breaking context. It's crucial in this dream of mine that we would have a programming language that has formal properties, because we have to consider that all robots, if they're useful, are going to be life critical. It's, you know, it's one thing if your computer dies on you. It's another thing if your avionics system dies on you, and it's a worse thing if your robot assistant does things that are completely out of scope of what it was supposed to be able to do. So the path, the royal road to functional programming languages that have well characterized, that are themselves characterized as good mathematical objects, having good denotational semantics, yet live in the physical world in a grounded manner. That is, they have clear operational semantics. The royal road goes to Criterion. Paul Gustafson is going to be talking more about that tomorrow. You know, ultimately, we want to learn things, but it's what we want to learn. It's not easy to learn continuous functions if you know the domain and the codomain. But there have been dramatic advances in. I don't have to tell you guys how wonderful it is to have these new learning parameterizations. But what we're after is learning not the function necessarily, but learning the domains and the codomains. And those problems reduce to questions of topology. What are the classes? What are the characterizations of the spaces? What are the limitations on the spaces? How do you deal with them? How do you think about them computationally? So you guys you and Konstantin's group are doing that every day. Yuli has been, in some sense, the person that I've been talking to the longest about how to do this in a more mathematically sound fashion. And so he'll be talking about his own ideas about this later in the Afternoon. So my talk, and again, I'm going to try to finish my talk at 12:25. We'll see how well I do. I'm going to talk about sort of the background inspiration from biology and math, which you won't find in my propaganda paper. I'm going to talk about the challenges to that inspiration, which you will find in this propaganda paper. I think I'm going to scoot over the formal progress that we've made because Matt's going to be talking about the Conley, the way in which so we've got these practicable models which are pretty good. They're simple, but they're pretty good at describing a rich range of physical behaviors in the robotics world. So they're practicable models. Matt's been pioneering how we can recover dynamical properties out of these models, and he'll talk about that tomorrow morning. Again, Paul's been talking about the categorical properties. He's used ideas from Conley chains, epsilon T chains, to force a categorification of these models, which is the first step on the way to a type theory. And then, as I've said, Yuli's been thinking a lot with us about the structure of these spaces. What I'll do instead is I'll spend most of my time, hopefully, just showing you movies about the kinds of things that we can do in a partly formal way, but largely informal way, that we hope that collaborations with Yuli, Matt, and Paul on the one hand, and maybe with groups like this, would begin to make more completely formal on the one hand and learnable on the other hand. Okay, so I'll focus on the first bullet, inspiration, and the last bullet, empirical progress, and I'll let my intellectual betters, I'll talk a little bit about the challenge, but formal progress, I'll leave that to my intellectual betters later in the symposium. Yeah, okay, so roughly speaking, we've been working with what Bob Full and I call templates and anchors in robotics and biology for quite a while. Where I ask you, I hope you can see that there's a red machine with 4 degrees of freedom, and there's a white ghost that looks like a pogo stick embedded in that machine. Is that coming through in the movie? Okay, and so the pogo stick is a 2 degree of freedom Lagrangian system, and the ankle, knee, hip thing is a 4 degree of freedom Lagrangian system. And what we've done here is an informal anchoring of the red machine in the dynamics of the white machine. Anchoring, and we'll talk more about anchoring. But you have to choose a posture. You have to decide what submanifold you want your attracting invariant dynamics to live on. So we would like the red machine to have an attracting invariant dynamical subsystem, which is conjugate to the pure white machine. And we get to choose, of course, in an 8-dimensional space, there are lots and lots of ways to embed a 4-dimensional space, okay? And so we've been playing these games with some degree of success formally, but much more empirical success. The Rex, for example, was the first legged robot ever to run without being plugged into the wall, and was the first machine ever to go at any speed outdoors. You know, there had been creepy crawly legged machines before Rex came along in 2001, and Rex empirically achieves this hierarchical composition in ways that we understand better 20 years later, but still don't completely understand. So in addition to hierarchical compositions, we need to have parallel compositions. Here's work by Avik Dey, who graduated from my group about 5 years ago. He's the chief, I don't know, he founded Ghost Robotics, and he also showed us how to realize parallel compositions, whereby even though the mechanics of these machines is highly coupled, you pretend that each hip is its own vertical hopper, and you try to get away with self-excited vertical motions that can be perturbed in such a fashion that you prove that you get limit cycles of low dimension, right? So that you're on a high degree of freedom torus, but you'd like to converge to the anti-phase bounding trajectory of this lower degree of freedom torus. And Avik has theorems about when we know how to do that. But also, we don't have very many sufficient necessary conditions, mainly sufficient conditions. And these theoretical points of view, I'm going to talk about these compositions later at the end of my talk when I review where we're going for, empirically. These things are good enough and robust enough that you can reuse these methods in dramatically different morphologies. So that's the kind of thing that we want to do. We want to be able to reuse our dynamical primitives and compose them with formally preserved properties. Okay, so in addition to hierarchical and parallel, it's crucial to be able to sequence things. Here's Turner Topping showing you how to get our new, the ghost machine to jump up, grab the door handle, push through the door, and go through the door. But that was all open loop. What I'm going to review later on in the talk is how we've begun to turn these compositions into more formal. These are closed loop, and so they're not guaranteed to work, but they work very, very, very robustly without Turner holding his breath. He's still got to do a lot of robo whispering, but their feedback, they're closed loop in the continuous mode, and so they work really, really, really well. And what we aspire to do is have them not simply be closed loop in the continuous modes, but we aspire to have them be closed loop in the what Paul Gustafson will call the directed system, the hybrid system that obtains when you're constantly changing the modes. Okay, so you're constantly changing the modes, and suppose a mode failure occurred, we have feedback within modes to handle failure in the continuous time. What do we do about mode failures, and how do we program in a way that's sound for that? So that's what I'll try to spend most of my time at the talk. Quickly, the inspiration for anchoring templates comes initially from biology, where my colleagues in biology, Bob Full in particular, have shown that, for example, anytime animals run, anytime they've been run over force plates, it turns out that the force plate thinks that it's a pogo stick running over them. And this was understood by the most brilliant roboticist of the 20th century, Mark Rayburn, who built a series of pogo sticks. It was the first time, this had a huge impact on me and everybody else. It was the first time that we began to see that robotics is all about programming work. He really taught us that, I would say. My colleague Bob Full pointed out that the animals appear to be sprawled, and you think that means they're quasi-static, but really they're dynamical in the horizontal plane as much as they're dynamical in the vertical plane. And when you take that point of view, here's Martin Buehler's work in Rex from the year. We had a very dramatic meeting at IMA in Minnesota about 23 years ago. And Martin was so inspired by listening to the biologist that he designed this simulation, and he built it 2 years later. And when you tune up Rex, which was this first running legged machine, it turns out if you tune it properly, then you can empirically show that that the ground reaction forces look like those of the pogo stick. We took these ideas from Rayburn and biology, and we built them in very, very different morphologies. We took the vertical one hop from Rayburn and we turned it into, this is Martin Buehler's PhD thesis with me back in 1990. We turned it into a juggling machine. Al Rizzi's thesis then said, okay, if we can do a parallel composition of a vertical invariant submanifold with a horizontal killing of the energies, then we should be able to get spatial juggling, and so on and so forth. So we've been practicing these things with certain degrees, with great empirical success and a certain amount of formal insight as well, although never as much formal insight as you might want. The inspiration, of course, for the notion of hierarchical composition, which in some sense is the most important one, I would say, comes from the dynamical systems community. It goes way back, at least as far as, the collapse of dimension in dynamics is older than the folklore of the world of dynamical systems theory, right? But in some sense, it was Fenichel and Shub, or Herschen and Shub, who got that going. Here's a picture from Matt Fallheim's thesis where he's illustrating this idea that your fast dynamics disappears quickly, and what's left behind is the thing that you see empirically, which is this blue low degree of freedom invariant submanifold. We're not interested typically in chaos or strange attractors, although they sometimes are useful. We're interested typically in things that have much more simple spatiotemporal structure, but that it's possible that you want to polish the surface of your car and you want some kind of a strange attractor, to get a variable trajectory. But in general, we're going to be thinking about the blue thing as very, very structured limit cycles or minimal sets tori and that kind of stuff. And then the yellow space, the high degree of freedom space, is wild because you're in the real world and there are lots and lots of degrees of freedom that you don't control. Okay, so these are ideas that go back to the folklore of dynamical systems theory. And if you have a hyperbolic structure, then that structure will persist up the local conjugacy. You know, John Buchenheimer in the 70s, when I got to know him in the 80s, he had been the pioneer of trying to figure out what the foliations of the basins looked like. He called them isochrons after Winfrey. Fenichel, of course, pursued this work with a focus on geometric singular perturbation theory. For me, the most exciting development has been recently from Matt Kvalheim and Jaap Eldering, working with a former doctoral student of mine, Shai Rivston, who gave a global characterization of this asymptotic phase of this embeddable sense of what the foliations are that converge down to the shadow on the invariant submanifold, the tracking submanifold. Okay, and we've practiced these things in orthodox in very, very special situations. The paradigm of this is a, for example, would be a critically damped linear time invariant mechanical system, right? Because there's an attracting invariant submanifold and the restriction dynamics look like a gradient system. When you have enough degrees of actuator freedom, here's a paper by Al Rizzi just before he left to become the second chief robot scientist at Boston Dynamics, where he took these ideas about anchoring templates in a formal way and he made them work for an automated factory on a tabletop that he'd been working on. Later students of mine have come up with special settings where you can almost get these formal attracting invariant submanifolds. But mostly we can't get them. And there are two different reasons that we can't get them. One reason is that we never have enough actuation. Power is always limited. You don't really you'd like to think about doing things with your legs, but you're going to work with Rex as if it's a unicycle on the plane. Okay, that's fine. But if you're working with Rex as though it's a unicycle on the plane, what Rex is going to do is it's going to try to do visual servoing. Let's first talk about, you know, Rex has eyes, it's got a camera, it's going to look at, yikes, I'm already behind. Let me race through this because I want to get to the more recent empirical work. I think you guys can understand that if you don't have enough actuated degrees of freedom, it's not clear that you can always get these embedded attractors in a formal way. In fact, there are theorems that say that you can't if you're underactuated. So what I'm doing here is I'm showing you, let me just show you the movie. Here is the camera's eye view on the bottom of the rigid transformations of a blue, red, and green beacon family that's rigidly related. They're rigidly related to each other. They're all on a bar. And I'm doing hand-based visual servoing where I try to get the blue, red, and green dots to move in SE2 in such a fashion to line up with where the boss wants. Okay. In this picture, the boss wants the red dot, which is Z1, to go to Z1 star. It wants the blue dot, which is Z2, to go to Z2 star. It wants the green dot, which is Z3, to go to Z3 star. I apologize for the bad color, right? And so that's what it looks like in the space of Euclid, in the space of rigid transformations, and that's what it looks like on the camera image plane. So put a potential function on the camera image plane that goes low where the boss wants you to be, and goes high wherever you would lose sight of the beacons. Where would you lose sight of the beacons? You'd lose sight of the beacons if it's rotated in such a fashion that the green bead obscures the red bead, right? Or that's one obstacle. Another obstacle is if your visual cone leaves you're not facing all the beacons anymore. Okay, so here is Gabriel Lopez's thesis from 2005, 2006, 2007, and we know by Brockett's theorem that Matt might talk about a little bit, but probably not tomorrow. We know that you can't implement a 3-degree of freedom gradient field in a unicycle, even though the unicycle is completely controllable. You can go from any position and orientation in SE2 to any other using controls, but you can't do it with smooth feedback. All right. So what Gabriel did was he said, okay, let me build a hybrid system. And in my hybrid system, as this cartoon is trying to show, I'll have two different controllers. I'll have a controller which knows, you can see my cursor, it knows how to scoot around on the level curves, the level surfaces of one Lyapunov function that encodes the goal and encodes the obstacles. And then it hybridly switches when it gets stuck on a local minimum, it hybridly switches to one which is trying to find the center manifold of this thing induced by the first vector field. And that works very well. And I'm not going to show you the movies because I'm kind of rushing. Okay, but so one major obstacle to templates and anchors hierarchical composition is that you're always underactuated. And you can never really get these things embedded in the way you wanted them to be embedded. A second central problem is that the environment gets a vote. Here's Aaron Johnson's work on trying to get Rex to leap up onto surfaces. And what he observed was that you had to pay attention to effectively a simplicio complex of environments, whereby you've got, if you've got a nose and a leg, a nose and a front leg and a rear leg and a butt, then you can have nothing in contact with the ground. You could have your rear leg or your front leg in contact with the ground. You could have your butt in contact with the ground or your nose in contact with the ground. You could have, there's a combinatorial choice of environmental conditions, and they're connected up to each other in a very, very nice structured fashion. But coming up with the way to exploit these different environmental properties as you move up the energy barrier from the low energy state at the bottom to the high energy state on the ledge is not at all trivial. Aaron figured out how to do this because he's really, really, really smart. He's a great robo whisperer. And these things are all open loop and they work really well. He was so good that he figured out how to do mechanics in part of the environmental complex that I haven't even written down, where you're working with the vertical walls as well as the horizontal walls. And he did it because he's a human being and he knows how to learn. Okay, this is Aaron Johnson, the brilliant robo whisperer, learning how to exploit the ground reaction complex to get from a low energy state to a high energy state. Okay, so that's where we were 10 years ago, roughly. And what's going on here is that you don't get to choose all the hybrid transitions. If you got to choose all the hybrid transitions, life would be good. Okay, but you don't get to choose them. I'm now realizing I'm at 12:25. I'm gonna skip. Let me skip over. Let me show you what I'm skipping over. I'm skipping over the parts that. Okay, so what I'm skipping over is Aaron built a very nice hybrid dynamical systems model that's good. It's good for describing things like the ground reaction complex and robots interacting with it. Paul Gustafson, working with a colleague of ours at AFRL, Jared Culbertson, showed that, the nice thing about this hybrid system is that it's consistent, unlike most hybrid systems that are physically practicable. This has guaranteed existence and uniqueness conditions, all right? And what Paul was able to show, working with Jared, using ideas of Conley's epsilon T chain ideas, that you could get a nicely behaved category out of this class of hybrid dynamical systems. And that's then the royal road to type theory, which is the royal road to a programming language. And Paul will talk about that maybe tomorrow. The thing I'm also not going to show you is what Matt will talk about tomorrow, which is that family of dynamical systems which works in the practical world and also has these nice dynamical and categorical properties, also is good enough dynamically to support versions of Conley's theorem. And that's terribly important for reasons that I hope are beginning to be obvious from my insistence on Lyapunov functions and things like that and basis of attraction. But Matt will talk about that more tomorrow. Where I want to stop is just give you a sense of, I guess I was wildly optimistic in how quickly I was going to cover this stuff. How unusual, right? So this is all feedback based. I tried to show you that this is Turner Topping's thesis. He's working on these ideas right now. This is a 2-year-old paper that he did where these energetic ascents are completely formal in the sense that we work out the ascent path through the ground reaction complex. We plan explicitly in this paper, we plan explicitly what the anchoring controllers are, and we implement those anchoring controllers. So it's all closed loop within a mode, but it's all open loop between modes. If we're dead, if there's a mistake in a transition and we go to a different contact condition and environment, that we're dead, okay? I'm just trying to show you that the traces are really, really consistent within modes. These are not fragile anymore the way they were in Aaron's day, okay? Whereas what's coming is what I want to show you in closing on this last page is that Avik, before he left, developed what we've come to call a universal sagittal plane template composition, wherein you take the body in XY theta, you take its Cartesian position and body orientation, and you break it up into a 2-degree of freedom pendulum, whether it's hanging or inverted, plus the orientation. And then, for example, we understand now, because of its compositions, we understand in advance how to get high enough and the right pitching velocity independently to get a 270-degree flip or a 360-degree of freedom flip, right? Because we're using these parallel compositions in a closed loop way. And we can get either, if you want to leap across a big gap, then you're going to need to use the whole length of your body, right? And so you need to have a pitch active brachiating pogo stick or pendulum, right? Whereas if you have links that are close by, then what you might be able to do is if you might be able to pump up enough energy that you can stay upright. You might want it to stay upright, in which case you want to pitch steady pogo stick, and you want to sequence the pitch steady pogo sticks. Now, all right. I think what I'll do is let me just race through this thing and give you a feeling for what I mean when I say edge reactive. Okay, here's a mini tour making a successful gap jump using the ideas from the previous slide. Here it is being fooled by a banana peel. It slips on the banana peel and it lands on its back. It's in trouble. Here it knew how to recover. It had an edge closed loop as well as a node closed loop scheme, and so it could recover. And here, even though it's catastrophically slipping, it realizes that it can create a virtual substrate and use the pogo stick on the virtual substrate in between to leap across finally. So these are completely automated. They're no longer just within mode reactive. They are graph reactive in the ground reaction complex, given that you had a goal in the GRC. Sorry, guys, I was too ambitious as always. I'm sorry to have gone with no minutes left, but at least
no problem. I'm going to keep mine short. So if there are questions, a couple of quick questions, I think we can handle those. Linda.
Hi. So how stable are these when noise is introduced? What if somebody pushes the robot and things like that?
Yeah, the basins are often large. They're not always large, but the basins, we often, not always, but we often have good insight into the basins beyond the, a conservative linear estimate of what the basins are. Sometimes all we have is a Poincaré map and a local linearized version of that. And so we don't know what the basins are, but often we do know what the basins are. And even when we don't know what the basins are, because we're using very robust trivial controllers, we're using potential dissipative controllers. We almost never use inverse dynamics or optimal things because those are very, very, very hostage to the learned or the recorded parameters. And we're using very, very robust, simple, stupid controllers within these modes because we can reason about the basins. So the answer, simple answer to your nice question is often it's the case that they resist perturbations quite remarkably well, but it depends on the construction. We don't have this down to a science at all. Am I getting at your question?
Thank you.
Thanks for that great question.
Is there another question?
Can I ask?
Yes.
So, Professor, you talked about the template composition. So I was thinking that if this is a special case for your robot, because it looks like that maybe your robot is specialized design and has a limited state. So can this idea be transformed into like more complicated?
Yeah. Great question. Haunan, we have a formal way of taking arbitrary, almost arbitrary sagittal plane limbed things, whether they have legs or tails or bodies that have mixtures of legs and tails. We have a paper which is just about to be submitted, like in the next month, I hope, wherein we have an algorithmic way of embedding with parallel composition, using parallel composition to embed a template of a pogo stick in parallel with a template of a pitching body. Okay, that's good for sagittal plane dynamics, and it remains to be seen, as you're worrying, how the extent to which this kind of construction can be generalized out of the sagittal plane to a spatial machine. Fortunately for us, quadrupeds and bipeds are usually bilaterally symmetric, and many, many, many things that you want them to do can be thought about in the sagittal plane, but certainly not the most wild parkour things that the animals do all the time. And so your question is a very important question for which we don't have yet a complete answer in 6 degrees of freedom. Did I address your question?
Yeah, kind of. Like, just one more, like, so you said that you were like doing a new research to transform that into some different robots. Can I think that if your algorithm works, that for, well, in a category of that robots, we can easily control them to finish what we want to do without specific.
I wish I could tell you that it's easy. There's still a lot of robo whispering that goes on. We're trying to get rid of the robo whispering, but we have series of robots. We have quadrupeds, we have bipeds, we have tailed bipeds, and of course we have monopeds. That the empirical practice is looking pretty good. What we don't have is enough formal guarantee, and so still in many cases the students in my group are doing a lot of robo whispering rather than formal programming. The goal, as you suggest, is to avoid the need for whispering to your robot and to be able to use compositional operators whose operational semantics lives in the world of hybrid Lagrangian dynamical systems. We don't have that yet. We're working on it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Professor.
Okay, so let's thank Dan. And Dan, if you give me the screen, then.
Indeed. Thank you very much. Thanks for those great questions, guys.
Let me. Let's see. If I do this wrong, then the wrong thing will show up. People, what do people see? A single slide?
We see your control screen, Constantine. We don't see your projection screen.
Yeah.
All those insults about me are going to show up, so don't.
Oh yeah, no. Let's see. What do I have to do here? Stop share. Let's try it again. No, I don't want this. I definitely want this. Okay, what do you see in that? You still see the wrong thing, right?
No, this is good. We're seeing we're seeing your animated screen, your projection screen.
Okay, good, perfect. All right. Yes, so I'm giving you the conclusion of my talk in the title, and so I want to get there. All right, and I'm going to start with exactly what Dan said that you're not interested in, which is beautiful picture. I don't have the nice movies that Dan has, right? I'm just a mathematician, so this is the best I can do. And nonlinear dynamics produces wonderful pictures of chaotic attractors and things like that. It also produces, and I think this is extremely important, very, very complicated bifurcation diagrams. And to me, the reason I'm starting with this is that we're kind of stuck with this, if we do nonlinear dynamics, is this wealth of complexity. And my take on it is that it's beautiful mathematics, but then if you want to do something with it, it's crippling, because there is just so much structure out there. And somehow what we need to do is to isolate what's the structure that we care about and figure out a way to ignore the rest. Since Conley's name has come up, I thought that maybe this is a good place to start. So this is the pictures that I showed you. In some sense, the theory was already well known by the early 70s. When Conley published his monograph on his vision of dynamics, which was a topological approach to nonlinear dynamics. And that's easy to say now, but I think what's easy to forget is that when we talk about qualitative dynamics and start with Poincaré, but kind of instilled in the mathematical community by Smale, this really was a theory of differential topology. And it's an analysis theory. And what Conley did was to say, well, let's try to look at this subject just with the topology rather than with the differential topology. And what he and his collaborators, students showed was that with this approach, you could produce a description of dynamics that was robust with respect to perturbations and parameters. And that, in some sense, gets rid of bifurcation diagrams. In some sense, I mean, this is very delicate. Bifurcations are fundamentally important, but at the same time, bifurcation diagrams for arbitrary systems are just way too complicated. We know we can't hope to resolve them. So in Conley's language, and this is kind of the part of the thesis of what I'm talking about, is that he says that if in my language you can understand the dynamics of this differential equation at a particular parameter value, then if you're sufficiently close to that parameter value, then in the language that he's developed, you still understand the dynamics. So this language of Conley really has two parts to it. One is the decomposition part, and Dan has actually hinted at that quite a bit. And the other is a reconstruction part. So let's start with the decomposition part. And I'm not going to go into any details. I'm leaving all the details for Bill Calise and Marcio. They're senior people. They've worked on this for a long time. And then the really interesting stuff, where this stuff is still falling apart and we can't make it work, that's poor Everton, the postdoc's job to present that, right? So, I get to show you the big picture. Everything looks cool. Bill and Marcio have to show you how things actually work. And Everton, of course, has to show the failures and the struggles. That's the hierarchy of academia. So Conley introduced this notion of a Morse decomposition, which is a finite collection of compact invariant sets that are ordered by the gradient-like flow. But the real thing you should be taking out of this, and this oftentimes gets lost, is not the invariant sets themselves. They can be very complicated. They can be very simple. It's the order structure. That's what's really important from Conley's decomposition. Now, if you're looking at it something like this, there's a bunch of what looks like unstable stuff. You come in here, maybe this is a periodic orbit, but you're likely to leave it and end up down here. So the stuff that's observable is going to be at the bottom of the Morse decomposition. And that's the notion of an attractor. But let's think about attractors a little bit more generally, and that is just some invariant object where if you have a neighborhood of it, you move inward on that neighborhood and you end up on that invariant set. And what Conley showed, and this is absolutely fundamental, and I think Bill will spend a lot of time talking about this, is that these are actually equivalent ideas, all right? So understanding Morse decompositions, which actually are computationally very easy to access, is the same as understanding the collection of attractors. Okay, so that's the decomposition part. And then the reconstruction part is something called the Conley index. So this is an algebraic topological device. And I'm going to black box it for most of this talk. But the fundamental thing is that if somehow you go off and you compute a non-trivial Conley index, then there must be an invariant set. And there's kind of two pieces that you need to compute this Conley index, two sets. And what this Conley index is doing is telling you something about the structure that has been localized by these two sets. And as soon as you kind of say it that way, then you worry about, well, how much does it matter what these sets are? And the fact is that if these two sets, they have to solve some they have to satisfy some properties, but as long as they give the same invariant set, then the Conley indices are equivalent. So this really is an index in some sense of invariant sets up to, well, deformations, because we know that bifurcations take place. They can lead to very complicated stuff, but I've already told you the Conley index is robust with respect to perturbations. So it has to be an index of a type of invariant set rather than an invariant set itself. Okay, so I think I'm being fair to say that these are the fundamental contributions of Conley. Obviously, he did a lot with this, but you know, if you noticed, he passed away in 1984, and then you could ask, well, what's happened since then? All right. So, and the details of this, I think Bill and Marcio will spend a lot of time talking about. So I'm just going to again gloss over it. On the decomposition side, you know, we consider a dynamical system. Think of it as a differential equation or a map. And what we've learned is that if you give me a decomposition of your phase space, and by decomposition, think of triangulation, you know, cubes, polyhedra, if you're going to be fancy, regular CW complexes, and some kind of understanding. So let's just say analytic bounds on the approximation scheme that you're going to use to understand this. Then Morse decompositions can be extremely efficiently computed. Now, I put the efficiency in bold because that's what we can do. The approximation and the decomposition are in italics because this is really where the rubber meets the road at this point. And just like numerical analysis is constantly evolving because people come up with new ideas of approximation, that's the way you should think about this. There's still lots of room for improvement on how you want to do approximations and how you want to do decompositions. But we have lots of results where we decompose a space and we compute and we get Morse decompositions. The second, and this is more theoretical, but equally important, is that any Morse decomposition can be computed given a fine enough decomposition. All right, so, okay, you need a lot of computer power, but this really says that the Conley decomposition part is a computable theory. It's not an abstract mathematical existence theory. Everything in there can be computed. The same thing, so the Morse decompositions are rigorously computable, and the same tools that we use to get these computations up here allow us to come back and that you know, there exists a sufficiently small neighborhood. We can actually give statements, here's a mu, and over this mu, any parameter value that's within the system you've computed at is going to have the same Morse decomposition. So we can not only compute at a single parameter value, we can compute on neighborhoods of parameter values and know the size of those neighborhoods. So we can kind of cover the space of dynamical systems with these kind of computations. On the reconstruction side, this is this Conley index idea. And there are a bunch of theorems that have been proven that kind of say the basic building blocks of what you care about in dynamical systems, they can be retrieved from algebraic topological statements. You compute this Conley index, whatever it is, it's a homological computation. You typically need to know something a little bit more, but the result is that you get things like chaotic dynamics or periodic orbits or connecting orbits or Lyapunov functions. I mean, these are things that are computable. So the moral is that, algebraic topology in the form of homology, and I emphasize homology because homology is computable, and I think Marcio will talk about the code that we've developed to compute homology. It's sufficiently powerful for allow us to obtain many of the qualitative results that we care about, all right? And we only need combinatorial information to do this. So 3 points of great practical importance are that the decompositions, such as triangulations, kinds of things that people normally use to break up space can be used to compute homology. Homology is easier to compute than one might believe. And this, I find very amusing that I'm writing this at this point in time, because Bill and I started thinking about this in the early 90s. And at that point in time, I was kind of like, well, I learned how to compute homology in grad school. I know there's an algorithm. And so, well, Bill and a grad student wrote a program to do it. And we gave it a simple problem, and it ran and it ran and it ran and it ran and it ran. And that's when I realized that, actually computing things was a serious subject, and that homology might be something that's hard to compute. But since then, we've come up with algorithms that are surprisingly efficient. So at this point, we are computing homology in high dimensional complexes, 10-dimensional complexes. I had a grad student who computed homology on a 29-dimensional complex, where that complex started with over 6,000 29-dimensional cells. I mean, that just should not be able to be done. But it says that this is the kind of thing, there's a lot of work to be done in this subject, but there really is hope to compute things that I did not think would be computable. And the same computations that lead to Morse decompositions are also the computations that provide you with a cellular input to compute the Conley indices. So we're not having to do something different up here from down here. And I think that again leads to this idea that we can efficiently compute decompositions and compute, reconstruct the dynamics in one blow. All right, so I think we've made a lot of progress over the last 20 or 30 years on these kind of points. And so I kind of want to finish with what's next. All right, and so my perspective is that, I kind of started with classical dynamics, which is differential topology. It involves analysis, it involves bifurcation. If you get results here, for example, by numerics, you get very, very high precision results, potentially. But what Conley did was he said, let's strip the analysis out. And from Conley, we realized that we can now think about this as a combinatorial subject, the post-set structure of Morse sets, of Morse decompositions. We can do the reconstructions, again, with a combinatorial theory, homology. We get rid of the needing to understand the details of bifurcations. We have a sheaf theoretic structure that allows us to interpret what Conley's telling us about. And because it's so robust, we can actually hope for accurate statements about the dynamics. We can tell you what's true. The accuracy might not have much precision to it, but there are ways to guarantee that what has been said is correct. All right, so, there's been a lot of interest in, uncertainty quantification. This is kind of a statement that you can certify, you can give certifications of certainty, but you might have to give up something on the accuracy. All right, so going back and forth is, I think, it's a very interesting subject, and I think we've made a lot of progress in that. And Bill and Marcio will talk about that, right? How do you actually do the combinatorics? We know a lot more about kind of the homology theorems that tell us about the dynamics that we're interested in, all right? So this path from left to right, that's what Conley did. And I think over the last 30 years, we've made a lot of, Tammy, if you could mute. We've made a lot of progress towards understanding classical dynamics. Where I think we're at now is in this era of data-driven dynamics, and this is why the title of my talk, and I think Dan already hinted at this, right? They don't have, you can't know enough about your system to control everything. So I think we're now in an era where we want to solve complicated problems, but we're limited. We have sparse finite data. If you give me enough data, then I claim we're back up here in this domain and we know what to do. But in this sparse finite data of complex problems, we need to build surrogate models. And there are different kinds of surrogate models that can be built. And Everton will talk about that in his talk. You can think about surrogate models, and this is kind of where Everton's at, of going exactly from the time series data that you're seeing and trying to fill in with some kind of analytic representation what should go there, or maybe analytic in the sense the computer has stored a bunch of information to try to fill in the missing data. Or another approach that is this idea of network science. In my case, because I'm interested in dynamics, these edges not only represent relations, but they typically are meant to represent causality. This has an arrow to this because somehow what this does influences what that does. Again, I think of that as a surrogate model. It's probably not enough to get dynamics. You have to impose yet a little bit more structure. But this is where we're at right now in trying to use these combinatorial topological methods to understand dynamics. So I think at the moment, I don't want to downplay how much work there is here. It's really interesting. You will hear some of this, but this attempt to try to go from these very sparse amounts of data that we're learning into, well, I like the classical representations. I was taught about differential equations. I understand models when somebody writes down a differential equation. But maybe the fastest way to get here to understanding is actually going to go through this combinatorial type models. So that's maybe what this work, from my perspective, what I'm hoping to see in this workshop. And so I will stop with that if there are any questions. Oh, Linda.
So does the Conley index actually allow you to reconstruct the order? Seems like you had the pieces for the dynamical system, but then you needed to reconstruct the order, or does this not?
So the order is, we compute the order from the pure combinatorics. Well, okay. So we compute a potential order from the Conley index, from the combinatorics. But then you could ask, is it really possible to go from this invariant set to that invariant set? I mean, the partial order might say, yeah, this is lying below that, but whether there's actually a connecting orbit or not, that's the place where the algebraic topology comes in.
Okay, thanks.
I actually guarantee that. Dan.
Konstantin, yeah, if I could ask, I wonder how interested you are in the hybrid world. So there are lots and lots of ways in which one imagines that hyperbolicity could be re-imported into the hybrid world, and that's a different discussion. But it also seems clear to us, particularly when we take the Conley lens, that the hybrid systems are likely to introduce new bifurcations. And so some of us are starting to puzzle over how to compute the Conley index in the hybrid setting exactly because we want to trap these topological bifurcations, whatever that means. I wonder if you're sympathetic to this, or if this is interesting to you, or you think there's hope here.
maybe I'm being too naive, right? Because I haven't studied it enough. I think it, you know, if it's, okay, so Conley was my advisor. And one of the things that I heard him say very often was, you know, if you can observe something, then there should be a way to represent it topologically, right? You know, we're really just working with posets and cellular complexes here. I would be shocked if this kind of language over here couldn't handle what you're doing. So yes, it's interesting to try to do it. If you can show me that it can't be done this way, then it becomes super interesting because it goes against everything I believe, right? That is, you know, if you don't have a sense of continuity, and that's topology, then there's no way to do any sense of prediction, right? Or guarantee of what's going on. So,
I mean, is there hope that the RIPs in the Conley index might themselves have structure that's combinatorial but more primitive than the nice algebra, the nice quasi-linear algebra of homology?
I need to see some examples there.
Yeah, we don't have them yet. Okay, great.
Okay. Yeah, I need to see examples before I. Yeah. We got time for one quick question, if there is one.
Konstantin, is there any information about the type of networks that you get?
Oh, I don't think of the networks that we get. I think of these networks that I've shown here as what, I mean, I'm mostly interested in kind of systems biology or ecological type networks here. So I think of that as being handed to me by the biologist. And what we've been developing, and I don't think it's going to be talked much about here, but what we've been developing, and this is especially with a group at Montana State with Thomas Gideon, are techniques to be able to, you hand me the network and I'm going to tell you what the dynamics is. So we're really just, you hand me the network, that's the input to our software. It does all this work for you and then tells you something about the classical dynamics. That's what we're working on right now from the network side. So I don't make the networks. I take the network as the given rather than somebody giving me a differential equation. They give me this network. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, why don't we give people a 5-minute break? I think it's Yuli is it Yuli who's next? I have to stop sharing my screen. Is it Yuli or Bill?
I think it's me.
It's Bill. Okay, Bill, do you mind if we start 5 minutes late?
No, that's fine.
Okay, let's start at 1:05. All right.
Okay.